Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Strategy Gap. Another fun conversation in store today. And today we are joined by Adam Sidoti. Adam is the Vice President of Revenue Operations at Redwood Logistics. And he has a unique perspective due to his unique career path, where he started originally as a lawyer and has since led roles across functions in operations, sales, and client success at both large and small organizations. Throughout his career, he's developed a passion for data and change management. We'll be discussing various aspects about that in today's conversation. So, Adam, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Great. Well, at times in our previous episodes, we've talked about the role that data plays in strategy, execution, and how to create a data strategy, and many things related to that. But for the conversation with you, Adam, we really wanted to focus on your experience in change management and the role that data plays within change management. One key aspect of that is how we think about data. So, what I want to start off with is, in your opinion, how do you let data tell the story versus just making decisions off of your feelings?
Yeah, I think oftentimes when we're dealing with commercial organizations, there's a natural like yin and yang or give and take between what you feel in your gut and what the data really shows. And sometimes it's great. Sometimes it's fantastic where what you feel in your gut actually matches exactly what the data shows. But I think we owe it to ourselves and we owe it to our people and, frankly, the organizations who we work for to allow the data to shape the story and the narrative. And there will be many times where I'll say, "Oh, that's interesting. I really thought that this person was more of a this type of person than a this type of person, and yet they're still finding success. What's going on there?" And I think one of the things that we have to allow ourselves to do is to let that data show us the insights, but then pick apart at that a little bit, talk to the individual and understand a little bit more about what are they actually seeing and feeling. And a great example of this is oftentimes in our organization, we rely on tools like predictive index. Other companies will use disk profiles and things like that. But a lot of times when you look at predictive index, it'll actually tell you, hey, this person has a profile that doesn't quite match the role in which you're trying to hire them for. I use myself as an example all the time. Um, if you dropped me into a conference, and said, "Hey, go around and introduce yourself to a bunch of people, go to booths, and get some information, or try to make a sale, or develop a lead," I would do it because that's part of my role. But at the end of the day, I'd be exhausted. And so a lot of times, what we do is we say, "Well, why is that?" And you look at my profile. My profile would say that, "Hey, I'm much more introverted than I am extroverted." However, what we can also find out by using data is that when you know, you may be introverted, but when you are an expert in something like this, right? This is a perfect example. This is an area where I feel comfortable and have expertise. I don't feel nervous or tired or exhausted or anything like that. So this is an example of where the data, if you just looked at my profile, would say, "Hey, maybe Adam wouldn't be the greatest person for this kind of a medium." But in reality, you have to dig a little bit further and understand how that works, within the individual themselves. So I think that a lot of times we tend to look at data as the end all be all. Um, and I think what we have to do a much better job of is saying, okay, let's look at what the data shows, and then let's bounce that up against what we see in reality. And that way we can understand a little bit more about the perspective that it brings.
So what I'm hearing is that basically the data allows you to potentially focus the conversation, at least know where to start, and then based on empirical evidence or conversations, maybe then get the full picture. The equivalent would be you could go tour a historic site on your own and really take it all in. There is a big difference though if you're walking around with an expert that actually is like the national parks person that's walking around saying actually that's where that person stand, and then it was a rainy day, and these are the types of things that start to really then give shape to what actually happened. So your point around introversion and extroversion is great because it's probably the most misunderstood thing. Oh, this person's boisterous. They love talking. They must be an extrovert, but they don't
Yeah.
really know on the other side that they're exhausted afterwards. So I think many of our listeners can relate. And so would you agree with the statement I made earlier around the fact that data at least allows you to know where to start the conversation? You have to be at least flexible enough to then let the conversation maybe lead you to a different outcome and not have outcome bias.
Yeah, I think that's 100% the way to look at it. If you think about it, I was actually listening to a report about the Houston Astros, right? They just fired, or they didn't fire their manager. The manager retired, Dusty Baker, and they were interviewing a like one of the journalists down in Houston, and they were talking about their new guy that they hired. I forget his name now. It's not that important. But what was interesting was the guy who was being interviewed said something along the lines of, um, "This hire is about continuity, and it's also about a commitment to analytics." And one of the criticisms of Dusty Baker over his career has been that sometimes he ignored analytics in favor of his gut. But just for as many times as you hear criticisms of that, I think it's often that you'll hear a criticism of somebody who manages too much by the numbers. So sometimes you just have to go with your instinct. Like you can just say, yeah, the numbers show this, but I'm in the trenches. I know something different. I feel something different, and I'm going to, sort of buck that trend of relying too heavily on analytics. And I'm a data guy, so I kind of like when I hear that, I sort of say like, well, if the data shows you 75% something's going to happen, you should do it all the time. But then somebody else would point out, but that 25% might, be impactful. So I think you're right that the data should lead you to a area where you should be looking, but you can't let it decide everything. I just feel like that's a mistake that we would make, perhaps to the company's detriment.
Are you more Jonah Hill or more Brad Pitt when it comes to data?
It's a great question.
Good
So
approach.
yeah, so I would say that with that's a great question because honestly, I love looking at the numbers. The numbers are, fascinating to me, especially when like you talk about sports or anything like that. But we see it in sales all the time. I was actually looking at some numbers today around a rep who's really successful, but not in the area where she's supposed to be successful. And the question then is like, are we putting her in the right position? Is she, is this a can do it, but just in the wrong spot? We're not setting her up for success, or is this just a stubbornness on behalf of the rep? I guess I would probably put myself more in the Brad Pitt camp because I think you rely on the numbers to help guide you, but you also have to take into consideration all of the other pieces. I think there's probably room for a little bit of massaging on that, right? Like my son is a hockey player, and I talk with one of the other dads on the team about which positions people should be in, and my instinct is to look at, well, in this game they were together and they scored 3 goals, so this like, but at the end of the day, like you talk to the kids and they'd be like, no, I was just feeling good that day, or yeah, this guy just made a mistake, the puck ended up on my stick in the back of the net, it went. So there's a time to look at the numbers, and I think one of the challenges that we have in these types of roles is it depends how big your sample size is. If you have a relatively small sample size and you're relying on numbers, you could run yourself into trouble. And I think one of the challenges we have in a lot of our organizations is that as much as we rely on data, particularly small to mid-sized companies, the you don't have the depth and the experience of data to be able to make that observation. So maybe I'm relying only on 6 months worth of really clean data or 8 months, whereas another organization might have 5 years. That's a big difference.
And for those that are maybe listening to this saying, what in the world do Brad Pitt and Jonah Hill have to do with data? It's from the movie Moneyball. So I will clarify that movie and book Moneyball, where the Oakland Athletics were the first team to really introduce the importance of data in decision making in sports. So give it a read or a watch if you haven't already, as it does apply to this conversation. But continue on the chat. I think we're in this conversation, we're kind of preaching to both sides of the choir, right? We're saying things that, oh, if you're a data-driven person, use data. But we're also opening up the door for people that use gut, like, oh, just use your gut. And I think both people are probably hearing what they want to hear. It's like, yeah, I know my gut's right, or yeah, I know my data is right. How do we think about the balance between those two? And using a good balance, like where is that breaking point? Because we don't want to only use gut and we don't want to only use data, but we want to have a strong balance, not just internally, but across our team as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing to maybe clarify also at the outset is when we talk about a data point can be a statistic, it could be a percentage, it could be something that's truly empirical. or it could be an observation. These are all data points. Now, how you measure those and how you weigh those, I think that is somewhat subjective. So depending on the type of person, whether they're the Jonah Hill or the Brad Pitt, you might weigh one more heavily than the other. As far as my own personal feeling is I probably start off with about a 50-50 split. I go with what my gut or what I think it's going to tell me. And then I also am like, hey, what is the data sending signals on? As I start to gain more data, evidence, whatever that may be, it's going to shift it one way or the other to the point where I'm able to make a conclusion. Now, my own personality, I probably start off sometimes with a conclusion, and then I always have to make sure I'm not just drilling toward that. For example, if somebody says to me, hey, determine whether this rep should be on a performance plan or whatever, naturally I know what their numbers have been. I've had interactions with them. So I have to be careful about not taking that bias into the analysis, which is purely a numerical analysis. Um, but I think it's all data point. I mean, honestly, I start with a 50-50 and I sort of let it massage where I think it should or where it ends up going based on, the quality of the data. Do they have 10 at bats? Do they have 100 at bats? That's gonna drive your numbers.
You're bringing up a topic that I think is very relevant to folks that are managing strategic plans and bridging that gap between what they say they're going to do and what they actually do. And that's the people on the team that we have, that are they able to do it? And you mentioned the rep, and it's one of those interesting jobs. Everybody says, oh, you should get into sales. I mean, it's extremely rewarding, and there's a big financial benefit, but there's no other job that there's a scoreboard over your head at all times, and a lot of data that they can use to see if you're effective or not. And I think, I mean, I could be wrong. I think I heard a little bit of a sprinkling of the EOS model, the entrepreneurial operating system, Traction, that famous book. And they say, looking at employees, there's like 3 dimensions that are important in addition to your company's values. It's that they get it, that they want it, and that they have the capacity to do it, right? If they're missing one of those 3 things, it's going to be very difficult for that person to succeed in their role. And you mentioned using data to potentially understand if they have the capacity and maybe if they get it. But how have you used data beyond maybe the understanding how they're hitting quota and things like that? How have you used data to make a decision on this person needs to be on this seat in the bus or off the bus, or we need new people to get on the bus? How have you incorporated that to make sure you have the right people on the team?
So you're right that the first thing that's the most interesting thing about sales to me is you can't hide from your numbers, right? You're either hitting your quota or you're not. You're either selling or you're not. It's extremely black and white, and that's scary to a lot of people. The people who are willing to embrace that are some of the best sellers that we have, right? They don't care. And I always kind of think back to a conversation I had with, one of my managers. We were talking about compensation plans, and he asked me, he goes, what's the best compensation plan in the world for a sales rep? And I don't know. And he said 100% commission, because that salesperson believes entirely on themselves. Everything that they hunt, or everything that they hunt, they eat. And they typically have really large percentages. If you're a good salesperson and you're confident, you take that every day of the week. We have a tough time, I think, figuring out, you have your numbers, right? And you talked about it. It's like skill versus will. You have the numbers and you can see the results. That's clear. But there's a lot of people who sometimes don't achieve results right away because their industry is such that it requires a long time to, scale up. And we have to be mindful of that and not make quick trigger decisions on people who would otherwise be really successful. In fact, a lot of times, even in my own organization, we remind ourselves, hey, if we had made this decision a year ago, based on that person's numbers, they would potentially be gone. But look where they are right now. Look what we would have missed out on. So we have to have a little bit of a balance. Now, one of the things that I think from a data perspective that you can do to help understand or help your organization to understand where they should make decisions versus not is relying on things like predictive index, disc profile, those personality profiles, because you can start to match that up. There's this one individual who we hired in the past year who, from the moment I looked at his predictive index, I was like, this guy is going to be not just great at his current role, but he's somebody who we should be thinking about for future leadership roles. The profile fits. My conversations with him felt like everything was sort of checking the boxes. but for one thing, he had zero desire to be in that management leadership type of position. So um, I think a lot of times we have to let the data push us to an area where we're asking those tough and challenging questions. So, for example, in the example I gave earlier about my own profile, if I were in a sales role with a quota, I think somebody would ask me, "Hey, you know, one of the things that sales reps usually need to do is to get out and talk to lots of strangers, right, and prospect. Based on your profile, it looks like that might be a little bit of a challenge for you." Now, if somebody said that to me directly, I might take it like as a slight and get upset. So a question I often ask every rep: tell me how you build your pipeline. Tell me some of the strategies you use. And by asking those types of questions, you start to bring out the data points. You'll learn, are they somebody who's going to have leads pushed to them? Or are they somebody who's really going to feel comfortable going out and getting them? Do they have an extensive network? Like, all of those things become data points to help you understand whether or not someone can be successful in the role which you're hiring. A lot of times we say, oh, well, this person claims that they hit 125% of quota. Well, that's great. It's, to me, the question always comes down to what is your organizational philosophy on demand generation. If your organizational philosophy is entirely like, hey, we have a great marketing machine, we bring leads in, you just have to go ahead and close them. Somebody like myself who wouldn't have to hunt, great. I could do that all day long, be real happy. But if your organizational philosophy is a little bit more entrepreneurial in the sense that you have to go out and hunt more of your own leads and do that, I'd starve. So you really have to be careful to understand what the profiles are. I don't have to worry about that as much with people who have that really high extroversion factor, who are comfortable in like an unstable type environment. um, you don't really have to worry about that as much. And that to me is, more of a comforting data point. I will also tell you, cautionary tale, is that I do have somebody on the team who is that high extroversion, who is very comfortable in an unstable world and still not doing well. So it's not an end all be all.
Yeah. It's like, sorry, it's like every time, like every mom's like, you should go into sales. You really like talking to people. And I'm like, that's not the job. That's a part of
Yeah.
the job.
Yeah. Yeah. I know my son
You
doesn't
should be a
ever.
lawyer. You should be a salesperson. You're like, no, it's not how it works, but it's such a mom thing to say.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because my son has the propensity to talk. I mean, we drove to South Bend a couple weeks ago, and I think for the entire 2 hours he didn't shut up once. And he and I are very different. He's more of his mom in that extroversion factor. I don't think he would love being in sales because he likes things to be stable. So he's probably the guy who's going to be a lawyer, more so than the sales guy.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and all of this boils back to kind of whether it's you're focusing on your profile or the numbers, it's all how do we make decisions to change either an individual or an organization. I think we've leaned in a lot on the individual side and how you think about different aspects of that, but shifting gears slightly to the organizational side, how do you then also think about leveraging data in those decisions? And we'll get on to kind of actually making that change. But what is the role that you have to think about on an organizational standpoint versus just the individual side? Because there are then many, many individuals that will be impacted by that change in the future.
Yeah, I think organizationally, it's hard because everybody wants to keep in mind the individual component, right? The personal relationships you have, those, it's hard to set those aside. When you're talking about organization, like reorganizations in general, you almost have to set aside the people, and it's really tough to do. Um, and you really need somebody in there with you who's going to remind you to do that. And it's usually a group of people, and you have to hold each other accountable. But you have to cast aside the individuals and make the decisions based on what the organization needs, based on function. Um, I go back to a few years ago. We were doing a reorganization, and we had salespeople and we had client success. And our initial instinct was like, okay, we still have these roles; they all have to be there. But it was interesting as we got together as a group. We realized what we really have are like people who are like relationship partners, and then people who are more just providing a service. Um, and instead of like keeping everyone in the boxes that they had originally, we said, let's put the boxes up there and stop worrying about who goes into what box. And that to me is the most important way of doing these in a way that's most effective and beneficial to the organization. You think about the functions that are necessary, and then you think about the roles as it relates to the customer. And then finally, once you've aligned on that, then you can start layering in the people and you take into consideration the personalities. But even the roles themselves, they have a certain thing. Like, what do you need a service person to be able to do? What do you need a seller to be able to do? A service person needs to get satisfaction and motivation out of just making people happy. A salesperson is going to have to not just make someone happy, but they're going to have to move them off of status quo. It's a very different personality set. So I think it's really important that you apply that into like these boxes, and then at some point you get down to like the individuals and making some decisions as to where someone fits most effectively, and that's where the real change management occurs. I mean, that's the challenge, because sometimes you have to go to people and say, look, you've been doing this for a while, but like, we think you could be really successful here, and we're really excited about that, and here's why. And I had a manager. That's how I got into operations. I was doing client success, managing a team in the Midwest, and very happily doing it. But I had a manager who really took an interest in my career and career development in general. And I remember clear as day, I was in Dallas. I was in a hotel room having a conversation with her about, my career and where things can go. And she said to me, you know, I know you love doing this, but I think your future is really in this like revenue operations space, which back then was really new. And at first I was so like annoyed by that, right? I'm like, wait a second, are you telling me I'm not doing a good job? But as we talked about the role, as we talked about the way things are transitioning and moving forward, I realized like that's actually a better fit for my personality style than what I was doing. So even though I was happy and felt successful and whatever, um, my overall career trajectory was best fit in this different type of function. And I think that's an example of like having a really strong conversation with somebody. I always give her a lot of credit for having that foresight, that conversation, and frankly, doing it in a way that didn't make me feel like I was being told I was failing at anything.
Yeah, we do that. We're a smaller company, and we have a lot of people that started, let's say, in customer success, and now are on the product team, or they started in sales and they're doing something else in the organization for that very reason. And then also the concept of really pairing people together, because sometimes, like at our organization, we don't have sales engineers per se. The account executives do a fantastic job, but when they get to the end meeting and there's 20 decision makers, either virtually or in person, it really does help to have a subject matter expert there, somebody that's on the other side of the fence, the client side, and the two together make each other stronger. They're definitely there's not saying that you can't do a great job and you can't close the deal. Let's just partner you with the right skill set to ensure that we have the best possible outcome.
Yeah.
And that sometimes gets people a little bit, to your point, on edge to say, well, what do you mean? You don't think I could do it on my own? And it's like, no, it's just always a little bit easier if you have two people in the arena with you. And the book that I think I've referenced before on this podcast, and I always scream from the rooftops because I prescribe to it, and so a little bit of outcome bias there. But the book Range by David Epstein, it's all about like how being a generalist is generally not a bad idea when it comes to being really successful, especially in smaller organizations, because you can't necessarily always just be tunnel vision. I'm in sales and therefore I can't do anything else, especially if maybe your skill set can be applied some other places. So have you had to have conversations that sounded like that? Because it sounds like you had a manager that had that conversation with you and it really was impactful. How have you then leveraged that to either mimic that, get better at it? And what kind of results have you seen? Are people
Yeah.
generally open to spreading their wings, or does it make them retreat and say, I'd rather not?
So I think I've had like the absolute honor over my career of working with lots of different types of people with interesting backgrounds, diverse thought processes. Um, and so it's really given me myself an opportunity, even within these roles that are sort of like these quasi leader, not quasi leadership, but quasi like executive type roles where like you're dealing with people in different types of disciplines. And so I think I've had those conversations on a regular basis. I mean, honestly, whether I'm managing them or just having a casual conversation, a lot of times what I do is try to think about what it is that someone is really good at and what it is that they want to do. And a lot of times they'll say, this happens all the time. Hey, I've been in sales for X number of years. I've had some success. I should be a manager. I ask them why. Like, why do you want to be a manager? There's a lot of things that you give up when you go to management. There's an individual who's pulling in a significant commission might be giving that up in favor of a rep who's going to be earning all of those dollars. And so you have to get satisfaction out of helping others in a way that you're not going to get the pat on the back all the time. That win report that comes out, that's not going to have your name on it. So all of those things that you might love about sales goes away. And so you have to ask somebody, what is it you really want to achieve? Where do you want to be when you grow up? Kind of a conversation. Um, I I had a manager who said to me once that he has sort of like a Mount Rushmore of people who he used to work with who have gone on to bigger and greater things, and he views that as his greatest success, more so than anything he's ever accomplished individually. That is an amazing thing that I try to think about all the time whenever I have someone new on my team, or even someone who I'm working with, laterally. Um, I think about that all the time. You have to have those conversations. What is it that you really are interested in? Um, so, like when somebody says to me, "Hey, I really want to be a COO." Well, why? Like, what is it that you really like about being a COO? What do you think you're going to do in that role? And then start asking them about their personality type. Does that, do you see that as being a fit, or would you get frustrated by this? And I think that happens. Um, Honestly, it happens for me on like a weekly basis where I'm having those types of conversations. I had two of them yesterday, and one of them, was like I was actually coaching a people leader to ask their rep, why is it you want to be a manager? Well, they just feel like it's their natural career progression.
100%.
You know,
Always.
Yeah.
That's always the
yeah,
answer, right?
yeah,
Yeah, and these are always the fun conversations to have with people, right? Because you're helping them map that career and map their future and kind of get them to where they'd like to be, or kind of course correct where you think they should be in the future.
yeah.
On the opposite side of that, there's the decisions that have to be made as an organization,
Hmm.
where either somebody's getting moved out of the organization or into a different role. Kind of thinking about the things that we've talked about today, or even something entirely different. How do you approach those conversations? Because many organizations, unfortunately, have gone and will continue to go through this based on the macroeconomic environment.
Sure. So I think if the decision is made to the point where you're going to be exiting somebody from the organization, to me, it's like a band-aid. You take time to make the hire, you go quick with the fire. And I know it's a callous thing to say, but what I always try to think about is what value do I get in beating around the bush? Like people use the compliment sandwich, right? Like that whole like, oh, tell you something good, then something bad. People know that. They feel it coming. So one of the best ways that I've seen it done is, you just say, frankly, we made a decision today to part ways. Today is going to be your last day. Here are the things that we're going to be doing, whether there's a severance or, you know, instructions around the logistics of handing back equipment. Um, but I've been sort of fortunate that in almost every case where I've had somebody go through like a performance plan that I've directly managed that ended up not working out, usually we arrive at the same decision together. Um, and oftentimes they end up in better positions, almost all the time. Like you look back a year later and you're like, oh, this person's doing this. Great. That's what they should have been doing all along. When somebody doesn't succeed in an organization, and I'm not talking about a layoff situation where, the economy just tanks or whatever, but when someone doesn't succeed and for performance purposes needs to be let go, that's a failing on the manager, almost all the time. Um, Now, there are certain situations where you put up as much as you can and it's just not working, and I get that. Um, but I really do take like personal responsibility when somebody needs to be let go for performance because I feel like I let them down because they're not able to perform where they want to be. It goes down to that will versus skill thing. Of course, if they're not putting any effort in, you get it. But that usually ties to personality type. I mean, I think back to a guy I used to work with who um, he had all the intelligence in the world. It just wasn't what he wanted to be doing. So he wasn't going to put the effort in. And I remember, 6 months later, he sent me a note. He got his master's degree. He was working in a new role, and he was happy. It all works out. On the layoff situation, it's tougher because it's nothing that they did, right? There's nothing wrong with their work. And what I always tell people is, really good employees who work hard will always end up on their feet. And I'm always willing to help and provide any kind of support that I can. But again, I don't belabor the point. I think that you have to be clear, transparent with not just the people who are being let go, but the people who are left behind, because those people are the one who are dealing with a really big trauma as well.
And the way you bring people in and the way you exit them out of the organization says a lot about you as a company. I mean, we all probably have seen the movie Up in the Air with George Clooney. That's an example of probably the most callous type of thing. It was like a remote layoffs, and here's your
Yeah,
book, and we're going to give you that. And I worked for a large corporation before coming to Achieve It, and that was very, very cold. It was basically all communication was cut off, all your computers were shut off, and you were just treated as one day you're an employee, the next day you had no access to your support network, which was the people that you work with.
yeah,
So at least working for a smaller organization and having experienced some of this in the past, there is a virtue in taking the extra time to ensure that people that are leaving either voluntarily or through layoffs involuntarily, that they land on their feet, and not just if you believe in karma, if you believe in good Glassdoor reviews. I mean, there's a million reasons for doing it, but it sometimes is overlooked because people try to get away from the awkward conversation. And ultimately, if you're transparent and honest, it doesn't have to be awkward. The only person making it awkward is potentially the manager.
yeah,
And that as long as you overcome that hurdle and that self-imposed hurdle, typically good things can happen. So that insight is very valuable.
yeah. I think most people are conflict averse, right? Most people want to get along.
Yeah.
Maybe it's my background as a lawyer that it doesn't bother me, like the conflict thing. Like I can have an argument with somebody and like 5 minutes later go for a drink with them because it just doesn't phase me the same way. And I think a lot of people who are in HR who are really good at their jobs as sort of managing people through those processes have to have that same mentality because otherwise I don't know how they get through their like I mean you saw it in that movie, right? Like you'd be driven to all kinds of things.
Yeah, living in
Um,
Omaha. You live in Omaha if you don't watch out. No offense to our viewers in Omaha, but anyway.
yeah.
Well, Adam, we appreciate your time today. Before we close out, one final question that we ask all of our guests. So, thinking about your career and everything you've learned and where you were at the beginning of your career, if you had to go back and give yourself one piece of advice, what would that be?
I think it's the same advice that I would probably give myself right now, which is to breathe, to understand that, uh, you know, you have to be confident in who you are and who you are as an individual. If you do good work, if you work hard, good things will happen. And I think that's a really important thing to remember. I mean, you can only control what you can control. There's so many external factors. You mentioned the economy, the environment, people they hire, people you're working with. You can only control the effort that you give and the work that you're willing to put in. And I think sometimes even today, I'll start thinking about, oh, what's going on over here? What does this mean? And what are they meeting about? And what's all that? Like, you can drive yourself crazy with that. And I think my advice is it's the same advice I give my kids. You can only control what you can control, and that's your own effort.
Well, Adam, I will give you kudos for the effort you put in today, and I'm sure our listeners would as well. So, thank you for that and for joining the conversation today. So, it was a joy to have you on.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the time.